I'm the editor at Nimbus 90, and it's an absolute pleasure to have Charlie Fraser here joining us this morning. He is one of the co-founders of Turn, the Entrepreneurial Refugee Network. It's an ambitious social enterprise and an ever-growing community with the mission to enable refugees to thrive through the power of their own ideas. So Charlie, it's great to have you here this morning. This morning, as Emma said, we are talking about community through crisis. While Charlie and I are chatting for the next 15-20 minutes or so, I encourage anyone listening to put questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. That's not the chat function, that's the Q&A box. So that would be great. And if anything that Charlie says sparks any thoughts, feel free to just add those as we go along. So Charlie, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Would you like to just kick off by telling us a bit about what Turn is?
Of course. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining so early in the morning. It's great to see so many of you on the call. I'm Charlie. I'm one of the co-founders of Turn, which is a social enterprise started in 2016 out of the recognition that our response to the refugee crisis was failing. So in 2015, when there was a lot of focus on refugee migration, particularly into Europe, we saw that there was a lot of focus on how you keep people alive, how you ensure that they come into Europe, but that we'd completely dropped the ball on what was happening when they arrived in Europe. And what we were seeing was a growing crisis of integration. So refugee unemployment was increasing, refugee deprivation and poverty was increasing, refugee underemployment was increasing. And we thought that was an injustice in particular because the skill sets of refugees were well known and clearly had a lot of value to bring to local communities. So what we set out to do was give refugee entrepreneurs a platform to start their own business by giving them equal access to opportunities, to networks, and to finance to local entrepreneurs. And so we ran our first incubator program for refugee entrepreneurs in February 2017. Since then, we've developed an ecosystem of 3 separate programs that run all year round. We've worked with 330 refugee entrepreneurs in the UK, 450 refugee entrepreneurs across Europe, and we have an active community of about 150 refugee founders in London and throughout the rest of the country.
Amazing. Can you just also tell us a bit about, I know when we've chatted about it, there's also the mentor program side of Turn. Can you just tell us a bit about that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. You might presume from working in refugee integration that it's been a pretty pessimistic 3 years, which has certainly been the case. But actually, alongside that, what we've seen is an incredible human response to supporting refugees into local communities. So for every 1 refugee that's applied to work with Turn, we've actually had 2 applications to mentor and support them in their business development. So we have a supported community of well over 500 people who are willing to give their time and their knowledge to support the refugees we work with in their business development. And we do that in multiple ways, one of which is through a mentor role, which is meeting with the refugees every single week during the programs that we run to act almost like a co-founder in their business development. And then we have a second category of supporters who act as advisors. So they give their time in one-off sessions every month to support the entrepreneurs with specific problem solving.
Yeah, very cool. And I remember when we were talking about that before, there's some really big brands in there, aren't there? Like Ben & Jerry's. So some big brands getting involved with that. Which is really
absolutely. Cool. I guess one of my main messages this morning would be that if you want guilt-free ice cream during lockdown, go buy Ben & Jerry's. They're a wonderful company that has dual social impact and core business, and they put equal weight on both. But yes, we work primarily through corporate. So Ben & Jerry's being an example, but we started within a financial consultancy firm called Oliver Wyman. We work very closely with companies like WeWork, Unilever behind Ben & Jerry's, with academic partners like University of Loughborough. So of course, a whole range of different corporate partners who we believe can bring value to the people that we work with.
I can definitely say that we've been, as a household, getting a lot of Ben & Jerry's to get us through. So Perfect. That's good to know it's guilt-free. So yeah, thinking about what's happening at the moment, obviously for refugees and refugee entrepreneurs, this is a really hard time. For lots of small businesses, this is a really hard time. what is the reality of the impact of COVID-19 on a community that was already marginalized?
It's been a very interesting but difficult period of time, as you might imagine. So what we saw about 2 weeks into the lockdown period, we ran an audit for our community, and we slightly regret not doing that earlier. But effectively, what the audit showed was not just that the business impact was profound, but that the impact on the entrepreneurs' livelihoods was profound. So we were expecting to see a business crisis among our community in terms of loss of business revenue. What we actually found was a personal cash flow crisis. So what we saw was that our community was just simply running out of money, and that they were going to run out of money in the next 2 weeks. So sort of by the midpoint of April, that they would actually be having to make decisions about what to sacrifice in their own lives to be able to eat. And we knew that would probably have permanent impact on their ability to recover from the crisis. So that really shocked us, and unfortunately that was then heightened by the fact that refugee entrepreneurs, many of whom sit on the margins of our society, were also falling through the cracks of the government response. So there wasn't, although there'd been a strong emphasis on small business and then a little while later self-employment, a lot of that was not appropriate for the kind of entrepreneurs that we work with, and certainly wasn't acting with the speed that was going to make sure that immediate cash flow gap was going to be filled.
So what was your response there in that situation?
Yeah, we had to pivot really quickly. So we were doing a lot of work around business adaptation, business pivoting, but then we had to broaden that out, and we had to be able to offer immediate livelihood support as well. So we set out with one of our partners, Square. We set out to raise £10,000 throughout April to distribute as micro grants to effectively fill this gap. And it was pretty amazing, actually. We managed to raise £15,000 in 2 weeks. And so by the midpoint of April, we were already able to start making grants. And so far, we've distributed just over £11,000 to close to 50 entrepreneurs, so almost a third of our community. And what that's done is it's perfectly met that need. We had this 4-week gap where we knew we could make a difference, and we were able to buy these entrepreneurs 3 to 4 weeks on average. That has meant that they could begin to access universal credit in most cases to ensure that their personal livelihoods are secure. And now they can start to focus on business recovery, not just livelihood support.
Amazing. One of the things I love about your community is the stories that come out of it. And I think when we were chatting before, there's been some really cool ways that the entrepreneurs, businesses have been pivoting themselves. So not just pivoting, but actually the individual businesses within it. Also changing how they're working and what their products are and services are. So could you just tell us maybe a few stories that you've seen there in that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's been a really encouraging part of working with an entrepreneurial community. I think it inevitably makes you look for solutions rather than just identify the problems. So we have 2 fashion entrepreneurs at the moment in our community that are making face masks for vulnerable communities, one of whom is making LGBT face masks to sell to his customers, and every one that's bought by his customers, he makes another one that he gives away for free to asylum seekers and vulnerable refugees who don't have access to mainstream support and often very limited cash flow. We have another fashion entrepreneur making scrubs for NHS workers. We've got a few food entrepreneurs that are giving food away for free to students and to NHS workers. And actually, over the next 2 weeks, we're doing a collaboration with Toynbee Hall, which is a legal and destitution centre in East London, where one of our partners is paying 4 of our entrepreneurs to deliver 200 meals a day to the centre for all the clients that come in to use the centre as a food bank. So that's quite a nice collaboration that shows how we can use the skill set of our community. We can drive business to those entrepreneurs and also meet the need of a community in poverty that uses Toynbee Hall as a food bank.
Really cool. Coming back to the ways that different large corporates like Ben & Jerry's, for example, have got involved with the network. When we're thinking about how, this episode is called Community Through Crisis. I think we've seen a lot of ways that humans can be really quite thoughtful and kind in this sort of situation. What are the ways that businesses can actually be helping and supporting marginalized communities like refugees during this time?
Well, for us, there's two phases. One is in the immediate future, and that is being able to support these entrepreneurs in maintaining their livelihoods. So there's a big focus at the moment on if you're working or volunteering with any communities that are vulnerable at the moment, focusing not just on the specific area that volunteering or that partnership takes place, but actually on the underlying realities of people trying to live their lives. The likelihood is that if you are interested in any vulnerable marginalized community, that at the moment there will be in a crisis of quite disproportionate impact. And that's been shown in multiple ways through multiple communities that coronavirus, unfortunately, is not equal. It disproportionately impacts those that are living on the breadline, those that are living in crowded housing, those that are unable to access government benefits or support for whatever reason. So my immediate request would be, look at your core business model and see how could your services, how could your time be useful to those that have no recourse to public support. Then in the mid to long term, in the recovery phase, what we really want to see is businesses recognizing that their supply chains, their values are very important to how we can rebuild our economy. So we are pushing for a new form of business partnership that isn't just a CSR model that says we'll give away 5% of our profits each year to a foundation or to a charity, but actually says that when we rebuild and come out of and emerge out of the crisis in whatever form that might be, let's use our core business as a way of driving revenue into these businesses or into marginalized founders, because that is the best way to enable the populations to emerge from a crisis. Give them your business, not just your charity.
Do you think following this that actually CSR will change quite substantially, more than just the 5%?
I would hope so. I mean, it was changing already. And I think it's still to be seen whether coronavirus accelerates change or puts a block on it. There was a growing recognition that social enterprise models that challenge big businesses not to just look at how their foundations operate, but how their main business models operate, was growing in a lot of momentum. But we're not sure yet whether coronavirus will accelerate that. It certainly gives an opportunity. It gives an opportunity for a new conversation. And one of the things that we know to be true about social impact is that it can never be it's never passive change. It always needs to be very proactive. So we're pushing a lot of our partners at the moment to recognize the conversation, recognize the fact that this is an opportunity to rebuild something that is more inclusive, that brings people into the inside rather than keeps them on the outside. And that we don't just accept that might happen, but make sure that it does happen. So come back to me in 6 months and hopefully I can give you a better answer on whether it has happened, but we certainly believe that there is an opportunity for it to do so.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed. Just to come back to one of the things you said earlier, thinking in the short term how businesses can be reacting, you said that they should be looking at their core business model and thinking about how they can adjust their products and services. But could we just drill into that with a bit more detail?
Yeah,
there are lots of the people who are listening are actually business leaders in some sense. There are lots of different meanings of that. But what would your message be to the people who are listening? How would you encourage them to actually be making that change and looking at ways they can pivot to help these communities?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's always very sector and business specific. But what we would appeal to is saying that when you look at your business model and you're interested in how you can have social impact, don't think about those two things as separate problems. Think of them as being part of the same solution. So don't think that whatever you're passionate about in terms of social impact, how can you free up your staff's time or free up some of your capital to donate towards that problem? Actually looking at your core business and saying, how can we use this to contribute to a solution to that problem? So if you're a software company and you have a personal interest in homelessness during the coronavirus, or even more broadly than that, the solution is unlikely to be as impactful if you give your staff time to go and work at the local food bank, or you give money to the local food bank, as much as if you use the skill sets, the digital skill sets that you have, to work with food charities that work on the front line to make them more effective. That's what we mean by mutual partnership. It's not just saying we can support you with our time and with our money. It's also saying we can help you with our skills. And too few companies recognize that what they do every single day is often incredibly important and impactful for small social impact organizations working to solve problems. And so there's almost no sector and no industry where what you do is not relevant to some social problem. But it requires proactive engagement in what that problem may be and how your business can be used to support it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's really important to hear this morning. Just a reminder to everyone listening who stuff that Charlie's saying might be sparking questions, please do be putting questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We've already had a couple come in, so thank you for those. Please do keep adding questions and we'll come on to those in a little while. Charlie, just thinking about then moving kind of beyond into what you've already talked about a bit with the medium to long term, and how businesses can get involved with building a more inclusive economy. What do you think recovery and rebuilding will look like for this group in particular? Will it? Do you think there's hope for actually quite a changed inclusive economy?
There's definitely hope. I think for the recovery for our community, I'll talk maybe about our community and then maybe the opportunity for a more inclusive economy more broadly after that. But for our community, we know that we're going to have to do a lot more work with our alumni network, so people who were trading before the crisis but weren't in any of our programs, to get them retrading again, and that we have to put a specific focus on those that have been disrupted by the coronavirus, not just those that are emerging on the other side of the coronavirus. So we're working quite closely with a variety of business partners in London to work out what does that business support need to look like, when does it need to happen, and what does success look like. The good news is that there are now business partners, business ecosystems like Turn that are thinking specifically about these communities, not just assuming that they'll be able to recover because of them being entrepreneurs. And when we think that will probably be appropriate is sort of September onwards. So we're looking at specific business recovery supports towards the end of the year that will help our alumni get back into market. So that's the timeline that we're currently exploring for our community, and we'll know more about their resilience and about their ability to rebound then. But the initial signs are quite encouraging, not least because we've been able to keep most of their heads above water, which was very important. In terms of the opportunity to use that as a launchpad for a more inclusive economy, it's certainly there, and we know that the government is interested in this in certain ways, and that the conversation for it to be successful needs to go beyond refugees to recognizing ex-offenders, homelessness, the elderly. There are various vulnerable groups who are on the margins of our economy, and that negatively impacts them in many perverse and deep ways. And what we're beginning to see is that a recognition that building inclusive labour markets is a very effective way of solving many of the problems that they face. The challenge that we face is making a coherent ask to government to show how they can incentivize that, because it's not cheap. Being able to build inclusive economies often involves quite a lot of upfront cost, so that you can then support them in having the skills to be able to contribute effectively when they're given opportunities. But there's different ways of doing that, and a lot's being explored at the moment. So I am hopeful. I think we're seeing an optimistic narrative. I think we've seen it around climate change with coronavirus. I think we're beginning to see it. People saying we cannot go back to what business as usual, that we need to form some sort of new society that is more equal, that is fairer, and that we shouldn't waste the opportunity that coronavirus has presented in terms of disrupting traditional business models, and we should use those to rebuild a fairer and more inclusive society.
Great. Well, thank you, Charlie. We've got some questions in the Q&A box, so we'll just move on to those now. Please do keep adding questions in there, and we'll get through as many as we can. So the first one we have here is from James Shaw. He is asking, how do you assess what is the most effective way to support these vulnerable communities? Is it every changing, or do you typically focus on a few specific ways to support them? I think ever changing. Is it ever changing, or do you typically focus on a few specific ways to support them? So thank you, James.
James, that's a great question. I mean, we spent 4 years singly focused on how do you support refugees in starting businesses. And so we know, and that is a very complex problem, and that's a subset of a much bigger problem of refugee integration. So my answer would be that almost certainly, when you're looking at a social problem or a social impact solution, that staying focused on a specific area, on a specific population, and on a specific problem will make sure that you get better and better at solving that problem. We see the least effective social impact partnerships that we see are ones that are based over 1 or 2 years rather than half a decade or a decade, because it takes time to build the expertise and the knowledge that allows you to ultimately unlock the problem. Unfortunately, if the social problems that we're facing as a society were easy, we probably would have solved them by now. So never underestimate the complexity of social problems, social issues. They're a lot like the business problems you may face every day that require incremental growth on every single day to get close and getting better at solving them. But what I would do in terms of choosing that problem and identifying that problem is start with something that you and your team are passionate about, something that you care about, and then connect with experts and be very open-minded. Be led by people you trust and by partners who you identify as being very good at what they do, and having a collaborative and open conversation. Don't assume that you know the best way that you can work with them. We often see that leads to a negative impact, not just neutral impact. Whereas if people go in and say, look, this is what we do, we want to know more about the problem, and we want to be able to collaborate with you in finding a solution, then that can lead to really long-term positive outcomes. And keep adapting and innovating. It's very unlikely the thing you do in year 1 is going to be the thing that you do in year 5 that will be as impactful.
Can we take that from the other angle as well, Charlie, from if people are listening more from a consumer angle, not just from a business angle, how can we, what are the effective ways to support as a consumer?
Yeah, it's a great time to be a consumer if you care about social issues, because there's an increasing focus on giving consumers a choice to buy with their ethics. So I think this is a really important part of that inclusive economy answer that I was giving earlier, actually, which is that part of the recovery and part of the ability to build an inclusive economy is going to be really led by consumers. We know the impact that consumers have on business practice. We work with Unilever, which obviously is a behemoth, and they are putting an equal weight on their social impact at the moment because they know that their customers and their staff base want to see them taking seriously social impact and social impact of their supply chains and the social impact of their products. So as a consumer, what I would suggest is there are now marketplaces and supermarkets that you can buy from that reflect ethical practices, either because they are hiring and working with vulnerable groups or because they are climate neutral or climate positive. Things like the ethical supermarket, the social supermarket. There are platforms for buying from small businesses that would need your business more than some of the big players in the space. Places like Truro, places like a Hive, which is a great place for buying books from independent bookstores. There are more choices than ever for consumers that want to buy ethically and ethically online. So I would compel you to go check those out. And from our perspective, we are launching our own marketplace for refugee-led entrepreneurs on the 20th of June on Global Refugee Day. So if you want to buy from any of our entrepreneurs, then do come join us from the 20th of June. And you'll be able to buy from initially 10 brands within our network to support them as they get established in the market.
Thank you for that. We have another question here from Jyoti Banerjee. He's asking, unemployment and underemployment are huge problems for refugees. Now, in the time of Corona, these are also true of the regular population. How do you think the post-virus economy will respond to your narrative of getting refugees on board when the entire economy is underwater?
Great question. So I think the starting point is that is that the unemployment, underemployment, of course, is right across the population, but again, that it's been disproportionate among marginalized communities. So wherever we see disadvantage, that disadvantage is exaggerated by coronavirus. So what that means with our community is that unemployment has spiked by about 45%. And to the best of our knowledge, among the normal population is between 15 and 20. So more than double in terms of the impact of unemployment and underemployment. To give an answer to the question about how you get either the public or the government to prioritize certain populations, I think it's not saying that this is a more important or more fundamental issue than getting the whole of the UK back to work, but recognizing that it's proportional, that the impact of coronavirus has been exaggerated for certain groups, and that as we rebuild, we have an opportunity to put those groups and the disadvantage they face at the forefront of that rebuild to get people back into work. And that we can do so with relatively simple re-incentive for businesses that are interested in these social impacts. It doesn't need to be a public sector-led solution. It can be a private sector-led solution, which this government in particular enjoys. And that actually private sector companies want to engage with these populations, but they need to be given support and economic incentive to do so. So that's the way that we would say it. We would say that it's not an either-or situation, that it's a recognition of a reality that certain communities are disproportionately impacted, and that there are ways of incentivizing good practice to ensure that alongside getting everybody back to work, we can make sure that some communities that were left behind before are now included in this rebuild.
Thank you for that. We have another question here, which is challenging some of what you've said.
Okay, great. I like that.
Every recession we've seen so far has led to an acceleration of inequality, not a regression of it. How will this one be any different?
Yeah, that's completely right. That's certainly right in terms of previous recessions accelerating inequality. I would hope that my previous answer showed that this is very much in the balance, and that we don't know which way it will go. I think the difference is the severity of the impact in terms of how deep and how quickly the deceleration away into the recession happens, and that the speed of the recovery is still to be negotiated. So I think for us, what we want to see is a recognition within private sector and public sector that previous recessions have accelerated inequality, that there's been a lot of progress within social impact organizations in the last 5 years, partly because of the level of inequality created by the last recession, on what an inclusive economy could look like and should look like, and that there are reasonable and feasible solutions to how we can avoid the same mistakes. We've already seen the government act incredibly swiftly to not repeat the mistakes of 2008 in terms of offering financial support to businesses to prevent bankruptcy. We've seen that flexibility and that acknowledgement of previous mistakes. What we want to be able to say is make sure that the voices of people saying we can use this as an opportunity to rebuild an inclusive economy is there. Whether it's accepted or not is to be seen. But the difference from 2008 is that there are voices there saying this. So am I sure it's going to happen? No. Am I hopeful it might happen? Yes. But again, come back to me in 2 years, and you can throw that answer back in my face when I've been completely wrong. And unfortunately, we're in a more unequal society than ever before, and everything's gone back to being worse than it was.
Well, I guess we'll find out. Another question here is looking kind of a bit further back to what happens when a refugee enters the country, and the challenges when you kind of first get involved with helping them. What are the challenges that you have seen when you first start working with refugees and trying to set up the businesses?
Yeah, it's a good question. So refugees in the UK arrive through two means. One is through the asylum process, which means that they come through Europe and come through Calais normally, and then claim asylum when they arrive in the UK. That process is incredibly traumatic. It normally takes multiple years. You're not allowed to work whilst you're applying for asylum. And really, one of the big misnomers about refugees is that they're similar to immigrants. Being a refugee is very different to being an immigrant. In fact, it's probably the most vetted immigration status that we have. You have to prove to the government that you are fleeing from personal persecution, violence, or war, that your life is under threat if you return to your home country. Now, if you imagine about how difficult that is to do, to prove that to a government, you can see some of the reasons why it's incredibly traumatic. And then you remove your right to work, and that undermines your sense of self and sense of control. So that's the asylum route. And that often means that we face extreme barriers in terms of encouraging people back into work, who've been out of the labour market for many years and are often dealing with some form of PTSD. The other route into the UK is through the resettlement programme. You might remember David Cameron's commitment to take in 20,000 Syrians by 2020, which we are on track to achieve as a country. And those people are given status before they arrive, and they're flown in directly from countries of resettlement. So in most cases, Syria or Jordan. And they arrive and they're given support and effectively for the first 2 years supported to integrate into UK life. So the barriers facing both of those populations are very different. In terms of business support, what we see is really two major barriers very quickly, because I know we're running a bit short on time, but two main barriers. One is at the idea stage. Often these entrepreneurs come from informal economies. The entrepreneurial rate is very high, but it's very spontaneous. So entrepreneurs are very used to starting in family businesses and just starting informally and starting very quickly. Whereas to be competitive in the UK market, you need a much longer proof time where you have to show that your idea is feasible and build up evidence for that being feasible. So that's an adjustment. So being able to build a viable idea is really difficult for a lot of the entrepreneurs we work with. And the second then is actually accessing customers. So if you imagine, many of you, you're probably business owners, when you start your business, your friends and families are your biggest advocate. They buy from you, they get cash flow into your business, they shout about you on social media, they give you traction. And if you're a refugee in the UK, you don't have that network. So being able to actually then get the customers to start and sustain your business is very difficult. So those are the two main barriers that we see.
Thank you, Charlie. That's all that we have time for today. So I think if you have any more questions, I'm sure Charlie would be happy to continue the conversation online, on LinkedIn or Twitter. And Turn is very much on both of those platforms. So you can have a look at the work they're doing there. It's really exciting and there's lots of amazing stories coming out of it. So Charlie, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to have you. I hope this has brought some hope for people this morning, and some inspiration as well as a challenge as well. So Emma, I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Charlie, very much indeed for all the work you're doing. It's so important more than ever, as we know, but particularly what stood out for me in some of what you said was looking at really buying by your ethics. I think that is a real opportunity to bring some of these key new workers, if you like, into an environment where we can appreciate them much more, support them and really help them in their communities grow, and also for them to support the communities they're within. So thank you, Charlie, very much indeed. And indeed, Shama, to you. As always, the most important thing for us is to enable our members to understand what others are doing, to share, to learn, to connect and to support one another, and also for our partners then in turn to help them too. So thank you all very much indeed for joining us. Please do join us on the 2nd of June, which is a Tuesday, for Chief Disruptor Live. That is virtual and we're looking at how to pivot to a new future. We're predominantly running 6 different masterclasses, 2 hours long, so that members can really roll up their sleeves, understand the key challenges, discuss them with their peers in a Chatham House environment, and from that actually put together actionable insights and strategies. So that's running on the 2nd of June. We'd love as many of you to join us as you possibly can.